Today it's Sunday, the 12th of July, 2020. I'm going to be talking about the notions of constitutionalism and militarism and how they apply to the current context in Zimbabwe. I hope that this will help people get a better understanding of the current structure of the state in Zimbabwe, and also those with an interest in trying to resolve the political dilemmas that Zimbabwe finds itself in. I hope they will be able to find some use in the articulation of the current situation in which Zimbabwe is essentially in a state of militarism. First of all, it's important for us to get a definition of constitutionalism. Constitutionalism is essentially a concept which talks to the limits of public power. It says that governmental power, which sometimes is referred to as public power, is divided between three arms of the state. That is, the executive, the judiciary, and the legislature. Under constitutionalism, the constitution is held as the supreme law of the country. It contains checks and balances. It also contains mechanisms to prevent the abuse of public power, as well as to ensure accountability by those who hold public power. Constitutionalism is therefore essentially about placing limits on the use of public power. In terms of constitutionalism, it is not enough for there to be a constitution, because it is very possible for a dictatorship where power is held in the hands of one person or a few people to claim that it is acting in terms of the constitution, but that would be contrary to the idea or to the notion or to the spirit of constitutionalism, which is essentially about dividing powers between different organs of the state, which is essentially about providing for checks and balances and accountability and transparency, and ensuring that public power is not abused. Therefore, it can be said that even though all countries may have a constitution, maybe only a few countries would truly have constitutionalism. Indeed, many countries might have written constitutions, but they would be acting in a manner that is contrary to the idea of constitutionalism. This leads us to the idea of militarism. A state of militarism is one in which a disproportionate amount of power is held by the military, is held by the men and women who control the guns and ammunition in a country. So it does not matter that there is a constitutional arrangement. You might have all those organs of the state, the judiciary, the executive, and parliament, but lacking behind this facade would be the military, which would be wielding considerable and disproportionate power over all the other organs of the state. In a state of militarism, essentially the military is the one that calls the shots. Power is held by the men and women who wield the guns. They are the ones who control everything. Other people might refer to it as a military dictatorship. This can be blatant, as for example, where the military decides to take over power in a coup, but sometimes this is done in a very subtle way. There may be a ritual of holding elections. There might even be a transition that the people might choose to call it a political transition, in which civilian politicians are presented as the front, but the reality is that power is held by the men and women in the military. In my view, while Zimbabwe's military has always had a huge influence in our politics, it wasn't until November 2017 that it became more blatant. But even then, the military was able to lurk behind the civilian politicians or the civilian facade that we currently have. I do think that the military has been disappointed and let down by the civilian politicians who took charge, and that in recent months the military has begun to reassert itself and take more charge of the state. In a state of constitutionalism, the military falls under the command structure of the civilian authorities. This is why in every country, the president of a country is the head of state and also the commander-in-chief of the defense forces. This is the same situation in Zimbabwe. Therefore, whatever decisions are made by the military, they need to have the consent and endorsement of the commander-in-chief. Now, we saw in November 2017 the military being deployed in the streets of Harare, Bulawayo, and other places in what was essentially a subversion of the command structure, because they were not deployed on the instructions of the then commander-in-chief in Zimbabwe, who was President Robert Mugabe. So this was a coup. This was an illegality. This was unconstitutional. But this was the military asserting itself, taking charge, showing that it had the power. Essentially, constitutionalism had been subverted in favor of militarism. The hierarchy had been subverted and the military was in charge. Very interestingly, however, where there were supposed to be checks and balances provided by organs such as Parliament and the Judiciary, they did not in fact do this. They decided to act to the contrary. They actually endorsed the military action. Parliament went on to take advantage of the situation and decided to impeach President Robert Mugabe, which was nearly done until he was forced to send a resignation letter, essentially as a face-saving measure. But more interesting was the role of the judiciary in that whole process. You would have expected the judiciary to have held back the military from doing what it did, or from asserting itself in the unconstitutional manner in which it did. However, we had a judge of the High Court, the Judge President, Justice Chiweshe. He actually issued an order which confirmed that what the military had done was perfectly constitutional and therefore lawful. The military had said it was intervening in order to defend the Constitution, and the judge agreed with the position that was taken by the military. The significance of that judgment and the significance of what happened in November 2017 cannot be underestimated. Traditionally, as I have already said, the state is divided between the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary, and they are supposed to hold each other to account. They are supposed to operate on the basis of checks and balances. The executive is the one that implements the laws that are made by Parliament, and the judiciary is the one that interprets the laws. Now, all these organs are also required to protect and to defend the Constitution. Nowhere does the military feature in this traditional separation of powers. As I have already pointed out, the military falls under the command of the executive. What we saw happening in November 2017 was the military asserting itself as a separate arm of the state with the power to hold the other arms of the state to account. In fact, its position was that it was not only defending the Constitution but also ensuring that the executive acted in accordance with the Constitution. And so the judicial endorsement by Justice Judiciary that what the military had done was perfectly constitutional had the effect of, in some ways, adding or reconfiguring the notion of separation of powers, at least as it applies within the Zimbabwean context. And so instead of the traditional division of power between the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary, we now have the executive, the legislature, the judiciary, and the military. But there is a very good reason why constitutionally and in terms of constitutionalism, the military is always under the command of the executive. It is because the military has a huge amount of power. Of all the organs of the state, it has control of the most lethal power within a political community. So, since the military has the most lethal power within a political community, it's very easy for such an organ to take over the running of the state. This is why it's important to maintain limits on what the military can do to create boundaries between military authority and political authority, and to submit the military authority to the political authorities. It is important to maintain this relationship. If it is not maintained, it leads to a situation of truly survival of the fittest. But this is what we know from primitive societies. Societies have progressed and moved over the centuries from that situation in which the most powerful, in which those who have guns or the most sophisticated military power are the ones who are in control of society. Well, we might make reference to other situations on the international stage. Of course, military power is always important. However, it is also fundamental and in the interest of society to ensure that power is held in accordance with rules of civility, in terms of rules that ensure that those who are chosen by the people and not necessarily those who have the biggest guns are the ones who are in control. The very idea of constitutionalism was developed in order to ensure that power is exercised in a manner that is in the interests of the society as a whole, in a way that does not allow a few people to wield the most power, which they can easily abuse. In order for me to explain the concept of constitutionalism, and hopefully to make it make sense to most laypersons who may be listening to this podcast, I want to refer to one of my favorite books. It's a book by historian Yuval Noah Harari. It's called Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind. A lot of my students will already know this because I love this book. It has some wonderful insights on the history of the world. But one of the most fascinating aspects that I encountered in this book is the idea of imagined realities. The notion that a lot of the things that govern us, a lot of the things that shape our world, are things that lie in our imagination as human beings. According to Harari, the genius of humankind, which sets us apart from other animals, is our ability to imagine. The power of imagination helps us to create things that do not otherwise exist in physical form. These things that we create in our imagination are the ones that he calls imagined realities. One example of an imagined reality is the idea of the nation. It exists in the mind of the people who believe in it, even without a physical territory. All you need is a significant number of people who in their collective imagination believe that they are part of a single nation. And so you find that in some countries there will be struggles for secession. In other words, a group of people who say that we want to create our own separate state. This is based on the collective belief in nationhood among those people. Take, for example, 20 or so years ago, there was no country called South Sudan, but we now have a country called South Sudan, which came after a long and bloody war. But it is because these people had, in their imagined reality, believed that they were part of a nation state. We have seen this in many other parts of the world. Another example of an imagined reality, perhaps slightly more controversial, is religion. But for you to believe, you must have faith in something that you have never seen, something that you cannot even see. You have to believe in the stories that you are told. You have to believe that they are true. While the world has a few dominant religions at the moment, they have not always been the most dominant religions in the world in the history of humankind. Indeed, there are many religions in the history of humankind which have suffered extinction. Why did this happen? It happened because people stopped believing in the imagined realities upon which they were based. People stopped believing in the stories that formed those religions. Likewise, there is no guarantee that the current dominant religions will still be dominant 2 centuries from today. Much will depend on whether significant numbers of people continue to believe in them. They have to continue to believe in those religions. And in order to do so, you need believers, you need people who stand by the word, you need people who defend, you need people who preach, you need people who carry the word forward. Another example which will appeal to many people in Zimbabwe is the idea of money. Money, as we understand it today, is an imagined reality. This is becoming more and more evident in the modern era of digital money. In fact, the majority of money that circulates in the world does not exist in physical form. It never has. The bulk of funds exists in electronic form. Take our Zimbabwe dollar, for example. When it died in 2009, in other words, when people stopped using it, it was because nobody believed in that imagined reality anymore. People no longer believed in the story of the Zimbabwean dollar as something that had value. By contrast, the majority believed in the imagined reality represented by the US dollar, as many people still do today. But there is also no guarantee that the US dollar will continue to be the dominant currency in the world as it is today. When the government reintroduced the Zimbabwe dollar in 2019, it was trying to sell a new imagined reality. They had a story to tell. The ability of the Zimbabwean dollar to survive depends on whether Zimbabweans' collective imagination shares the same belief as the government. However, we have seen that over the last 12 months, it has lost significant value because very few people believe in it. Very few people believe in the story that is sold by the Zimbabwean government in connection to the Zimbabwean dollar. This is why many people believe that it is destined to collapse and die again. Another example is when political parties or political leaders engage in electoral contests. In its purest form, an election may be seen as a contest over imagined realities. What is essentially happening is that political leaders and political parties are selling their imagined realities to the people. They are selling their dreams. This is another term that is often used, that the dream of this political party is this and the dream of that political party is that. They often sell these imagined realities in documents that are called election manifestos. They hold rallies, they have plenty of adverts on television and radio trying to sell the dream. They are essentially selling their imagined realities. individuals come together to form a political party, and the success of that political party or the success of that political campaign depends on the extent to which it is believed by the people. If a significant number of people believe in that imagined reality, it will do well, while the opposite is true. This is why in the contestation taking place between the factions of the movement for democratic change at the moment, the ultimate winner is not which imagined reality the courts of law validate or say is right, but the one that has the most significant following in numbers. An imagined reality that has few people will ultimately collapse. As you can see, the world has plenty of imagined realities. In fact, a lot of the things that happen in the world, a lot of the things that we do in the world, things that make the world go round, are not always the physical realities, but they are driven very often by imagined realities. So let us look at the concept of constitutionalism as an imagined reality. It is essential to understand the notion of constitutionalism as an imagined reality in the same mold of other imagined realities, which are fundamental building blocks of modern societies. The central elements of constitutionalism are that the Constitution is supreme and that governmental power must be subjected to limits. This arises from a realization that public power in the hands of a few is prone to abuse. Those who hold power must be guided by a set of rules which they must have an obligation to adhere to. But it is not enough to just have rules. Those rules must limit the use of power. Constitutionalism is therefore an idea that must exist in our collective imagination. The set of rules that comprise the imagined reality of constitutionalism can exist in either written or unwritten form. What we call the Constitution or the laws of the land, these are the written rules of a constitution, the written rules of constitutionalism. But you must also remember that there are some countries, the best example is the United Kingdom, which doesn't even have a single document which they call a constitution. Instead, the constitution exists in various sources. Some of them are unwritten sources. Despite lacking a single written document like other countries, the system that it has seems to have served the United Kingdom fairly well for centuries, although there are some people who now believe that it is important for the UK to have a single written document. So it is imperfect, but it is fair to say that by comparison, the United Kingdom has a better culture of constitutionalism than many other countries that do have written constitutions. This is because the political system has developed invaluable conventions and norms that assisted in promoting a culture of constitutionalism. I often use the British system as a useful example that demonstrates the role of conventions and other unwritten forms that support a culture of constitutionalism. The idea that the Constitution is supreme, indeed that it is a sacred document, is a vital myth which sustains the idea of constitutionalism. People must believe that it is supreme, that it is above everything else. The constitution of every country makes this claim, that it is the supreme law which reigns above all others. Interestingly, by analogy, if you scrutinize the most dominant religions, you also find that they make this claim of superiority and exclusivity. For example, they command belief and strict allegiance and prohibit allegiance to any other gods. The Constitution makes the same claim, that it and only it is the supreme law of the country. The God of constitutionalism is the Constitution, No other law competes with it. Indeed, everybody is prohibited from believing in any other law except the constitution of the country. Those of the Christian faith may recall that the fundamental character and binding nature of earthly laws finds recognition even in the scriptures. Hence, it is said, you must render to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and to God what belongs to God. But it is not enough for the Constitution to make this claim. Citizens must believe in its superiority. But what I find more important, far more important than the written rules, are the unwritten rules. While written rules are important because they dictate who has the power and when and how it might be used, they are not enough. Like I said, more significant are the unwritten rules. These are the norms, the conventions, and the taboos that form part of a belief system. They guide society as to what individuals can do and what they cannot do. One of the most important unwritten rules is sacredness. Belief systems hold a select group of things that are considered to be sacred, things that cannot be done. This creates essential boundaries about what should not be breached and what should not be done. The penalty for violating these sacred rules are often dire. In some societies, a person who breached sacred rules would be banished for a long time as a sanction against bad behavior. For example, those who know the beautiful book Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe, the tragic hero of that book, Okonko, he was banished from his village in Umofia after having committed an abomination. He had violated a sacred rule of the community, and he paid a price for it. This is why it is important to raise the Constitution to the status of sacredness. If it is sacred, it commands greater respect and protection. Humans are wont to respect and protect something that has sacred status. They are reluctant to desecrate it. They do so collectively in the belief that it is good for society. Most people would regard it as an abomination, for example, to burn the Bible or any item that is considered to be sacred by a community. The moment significant numbers of the community start treating sacred texts with contempt, the imagined reality that it supports falls into serious jeopardy. This is why societies jealously guard the things that they consider to be sacred. Those who, like me, grew up in the villages know that there were certain taboos, certain things that you were not allowed to do. So, for example, there was a day which was set aside during the course of the week. It was called Chisi. What it essentially meant was that you could not work in the fields, you could not do any field work during that day, on that particular day. It was a day of rest, and those who violated this rule would be punished by the traditional authorities. This was not a law which was written in the statute books. It was not something that was commanded from Harare, but it was something that society, communities in themselves believed in, and they guarded it very jealously. I don't know if it is still adhered to in the same way that it was maybe 30 or 40 years ago when I was a young boy. Apart from written and unwritten rules, which are important for constitutionalism, it is also important to have a set of champions who teach and promote its word. Just like the religions, constitutionalism needs its own bishops, priests, and pastors who preach the gospel of constitutionalism. These are what we refer to as human rights defenders, for example. It's not everybody who becomes a bishop or a priest or a pastor. They have to be trained for many years to achieve that status. They understand the religion whose word they preach. It's the same rules for constitutionalism. It needs champions who understand its meaning, who can teach it to others. It needs people who believe in it. This is how it draws in believers who are prepared not only to practice its word, but also to defend it. It has to be taught to those in the service of the state, for example, the police, the army, those who guard the prisons, because they are the ones who need to live by the limitations of state power. When we were writing the Constitution 7 years ago, we believed that it was important to have very strict written rules that set boundaries between the military and the political authorities. These provisions exist in black and white. I've already made reference to how the president, for example, as commander-in-chief, is the only person who has the power to deploy the military, whether within or outside Zimbabwe, and the fact that the military commanders are subject to the commands of the commander-in-chief, who is the president. But what makes these military commanders, these generals, not just in our own country but in other parts of the world, what makes them believe or accept the rules which subject them to the command of political authorities? Across the world, the military generally submits itself to civilian authority because they respect the rules, the norms, and the taboos that govern that relationship. It is absolutely important to ensure that this sacredness of that relationship, the political boundaries, is kept in place. It needs the military to believe in that separation between the political and the military. The word that is often used for this is discipline. When the military loses discipline, then it starts behaving as the power. It essentially takes over power from the political authorities. It subverts the relationship between the political and the military authorities. And as I've already pointed out, we have gone through this in Zimbabwe. November 2017 was an example of this. Now, we are not the exception. There are many countries in the world, especially in Africa, over the last 60 years, where there has been a subversion of this relationship between the military and the political authorities. Nigeria had so many coups in the 1970s and 1980s, 1990s, until the reign of General Sani Abacha. What had happened then in Nigeria and indeed in other countries which experienced repeated coups was that the relationship between the political and the military had become subverted. The sacred nature of the Constitution, the sacred nature of the rules that govern the relationship between the politicians and the military generals was now no longer being held to the same high level standard as before. In order for Nigeria to return to a constitutional democracy, which it did beginning in around 1999, was that it had to start reconstructing its belief in the idea of a constitutional democracy. This is not to say that Nigeria is over the hill yet. There are still challenges. It's a vast country, but it has done fairly well, being able to hold elections regularly. They are disputed, but it is in the process of reconstructing this belief in the idea of a constitutional democracy. Many other countries have gone through the same phases. Many people today admire Ghana, but some people may not remember that Ghana also went through its own phases of military rule. Coming back to Zimbabwe, at this particular point, Zimbabwe is at a stage where the rules, the norms, the taboos that govern the relationship between civilian politicians and the military are fundamentally broken. This is the most important legacy of the coup in November 2017. Although it has been said that the military intrusion had been happening progressively for more than 2 decades. Indeed, some would argue, as Professor Jonathan Moyo did during a recent SAPES Policy Dialogue Forum in which I participated, that the soldiers were never in the barracks from the very beginning in 1980. Nevertheless, what is not in doubt is that the coup in November 2017 essentially exposed the fundamental break in rules, norms, and taboos that I've spoken about. The traditional separation between the political and the military no longer holds. Indeed, the point that I've tried to make in this podcast is that the traditional notion of separation of powers between the three arms of the state, that is the executive, the judiciary, and the legislature, is now outdated and no longer reflects the current distribution of public power in Zimbabwe. The military is the de facto power, regardless of what the Constitution says. None of the traditional arms of the state has the power to hold the military to account or to keep it in check. There cannot be effective checks and balances against the military because they are effectively captured. That is why the military is effectively calling the shots. The most recent show of this power by the military was the ban of mobile money payment systems and also the closure of the Zimbabwe Stock Exchange. It has been said that these drastic measures were taken at the instigation of the military authorities. Therefore, the military power is not just in the political sphere, but also extending now to the economic and to the social sphere. It is for these reasons that I've argued that the current situation in Zimbabwe is a state of militarism rather than constitutionalism. A state of militarism, to reiterate, is a state in which the military is effectively in control, where the traditional controls of constitutionalism have been rendered weak and ineffective. The traditional controls, such as the legislature and the judiciary, are merely of ornamental value. They are misleading because their presence creates a facade of an existing constitutional system. So, what is to be done? The first thing is, of course, in my opinion, an acknowledgement that there is no constitutionalism to speak of, but militarism. Both internal and external actors must appreciate this reality. It helps to shape their policies towards Zimbabwe. The electoral process under these circumstances is almost a waste of time in a state of militarism, because elections are mere rituals performed for box-ticking purposes. If foreign actors who are concerned with Zimbabwe understand this, and that they are dealing with a militarized rather than with a constitutional democracy, they might design a more nuanced approach towards the problem. In this state of militarism, electoral processes will not provide a solution to Zimbabwe's challenges. The people of Zimbabwe ought to realize that power lies in their hands. They are, after all, the owners of all authority to govern. They must believe in the imagined reality of the Zimbabwean nation. If they do, they can build sufficient motivation to defend their nation. They must believe in the idea of constitutionalism. If they do, they can build sufficient motivation to defend constitutionalism. Only they can restore their nation to a state of constitutional democracy. The executive itself, in my opinion, is in need of rescuing because it is captured. The military regime's principle too is coercion, force, since its rule is not based on consent, and it is unable to get that consent. But it can only rely on coercive power for so long. It is expensive to maintain power through coercion. Agents of coercion must be paid to perform their duties, but in due course, it becomes a very costly relationship between the principal and the mercenary. It is unsustainable. At some point in the near future, Zimbabweans will have to discover that they have more power than they imagine, and that the seemingly powerful are actually just as vulnerable. In due course, in order to build Zimbabwe's constitutional democracy, it will call for a renewed faith in the idea of constitutionalism and in the very idea of the Zimbabwean nation. In conclusion, I began this article, the BSR, which is the basis of this podcast, by explaining how the traditional view of the state no longer holds in Zimbabwe, and how the current structure is or shows a fundamental rupture in relations between the military and the civilian spheres of government. I explained how Zimbabwe has moved into a state of militarism, the opposite of constitutionalism. I also explained that the idea of constitutionalism is fundamental in that it must be understood as a belief system and treated in similar ways to the treatment of other imagined realities such as religions. I want to conclude with a few points that encapsulate these crucial issues. So, number one, the military has become the de facto power in Zimbabwe, and the traditional notion of separation of powers is now misleading. Number two, militarism reigns over constitutionalism, leading to egregious abuse of power. Number three, the sacred text of constitutionalism is the Constitution, and a process of recovery is needed to restore this belief in sacredness. Chapter 4 of Zimbabwe's Constitution, which is on fundamental rights and freedoms, which command the state as to what it cannot do, are the equivalents of the commandments in the gospel of constitutionalism. There is need for bishops, priests, and pastors of constitutionalism. They are the men and women who spread the word, who teach the word of constitutionalism in the population, in order for the population to believe in it in the same way that they believe in the religions. There is need for a restoration of norms and beliefs that guide relationships between the organs of the state. These norms, such as sacredness, respect, and forbearance, are important in that they support the belief system of constitutionalism. Constitutionalism means the power held by the soldier must be kept in check by a more powerful force that rests in the collective imagination, not in the physical sense. It means the soldier must be guided by these rules, by these norms, by these taboos that are created by society's collective imagination, its collective beliefs in what is right or wrong. Therefore, the soldier must see the Constitution as a sacred text and say, I must respect this document because it is sacred. He must believe in human rights and say, I cannot break these fundamental rights and freedoms because they are sacred. He must look at a civilian politician and say, even though I have the gun and he only has a pen, and although I have more lethal force, I must exercise forbearance and respect him or her because it is the most important thing to do for society. He must consider the electoral process and say, although I have the power of the gun and can do whatever I want, society is better off when the ballot box is used to decide leadership and not the gun. If the soldier does not do this, if he decides to do the opposite, it is militarism and therefore unrestrained power. It is the antithesis of constitutional democracy. Regrettably, this is where Zimbabwe is at present and has been for some time. The picture on the surface might mimic a constitutional democracy, but it is a mere facade which is highly misleading. It is a retrogressive position from which Zimbabwe must recover if it is to make any progress. This cannot be achieved by cosmetic or choreographed changes controlled by the veiled hand of the military. This was the experiment in November 2017, whose outcome has been catastrophic. The country requires a complete departure from militarism to constitutionalism. So thank you for listening. This has been a a longer podcast than the usual, but it's because I was addressing a very long, big Saturday read, which I think is of utmost importance. I firmly believe that we must begin to see constitutionalism as a belief system that we must defend, we must support. And at the end of the day, power lies in the hands of the people. They and only they have the power to ensure that constitutionalism is placed at its rightful place, right at the heart of society, at the top of society, something that everybody should believe in. If we stop believing in constitutionalism, then we descend into a state in which only the powerful, only the mightiest survive. And that is not a good society to be in. I recorded this podcast outside, very beautiful place. I had so many neighbors, lots of birds. You may have heard some of the sounds as I recorded. They also say hi to you. Goodbye. We'll catch up next time.